Thank you everyone for joining us once again for the Psi Upsilon virtual speaker series. Our goal, as always, to share the best of our brotherhood with you. This evening, we'll be speaking with Dr. Barbara Hendrie, who is a Kappa from 1980. Barbara is the director of the UN Environmental Program for North America. She's had a distinguished career on both sides of the ocean. Of particular note, she returned from work in Africa to receive the Bowdoin College Common Good Award in 1993 for her famine relief work. She's a former senior diplomat in the UK mission to the UN, senior advisor in the former administration for USAID, and is an officer in the Order of the British Empire for her service in Iraq in nation building. A brief housekeeping note, if you'll permit me. The virtual speaker series is part of the educational and outreach mission of the Psi Upsilon Foundation. The foundation is supported by donations from our brothers. It is a 501c3 tax-deductible donation. Please consider making a gift. Our fiscal year ends at the end of the month. One way you might consider doing so is by texting to give, which is our new text to give program, which you can do by texting give to 317-399-4318. We aim for a conversational tone. Our moderator this evening is Alexander Senchek, who is the chair and board of the Psi Upsilon Foundation, chair and president. We aim for a conversational tone. What that means is that Alex will try to work in questions as they appear, not necessarily in the order in which they are asked. But we will try and incorporate all questions. Obviously, it's a limited format. We can't necessarily get to them all, but we will try to. With that, I'm going to stop screen share and turn over to Alex.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. I am excited to be in conversation with Dr. Hendrie, and really excited to welcome back to members of Bowdoin and the Kappa chapter to our wonderful programs. So thank you for joining us. Where are you in quarantine?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
And
I live in the district.
Oh, wonderful! And things are okay there. You're enjoying the what is now almost summer.
I'm enjoying what's now almost summer. To say that things are okay in Washington, D.C. is an interesting way to put it.
We'll get there. Well, I'm sure that most of these questions have a certain perspective through what we are living through, but I will try to address a multitude of areas. I'd love to start with how you got into this industry and really the work you did in Africa, because it is so at that time must have been incredibly intense, and for the early part of your career. Just how did you find your way there, and boy, what did you see?
So one of the first jobs I had after graduating from Bowdoin, I worked at Oxfam America, and I was the public information officer there. And through that job, I came to learn in the sort of early mid 1980s of the terrible famine that was developing in Ethiopia and Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. But I also got to know that famine was happening in a very political and contested setting, because Africa's largest war was being prosecuted in that region by an authoritarian government against two insurgent movements in the north of the country. And that's exactly where the famine was, the epicenter of the famine was. So I got a little bit disillusioned with my organization because they were reluctant to talk about the fact that there was a conflict going on, for fear that people wouldn't give money to support famine relief in Africa. But that meant that there were a whole bunch of people on the wrong side of the conflict, who were getting ignored. So I actually quit. I wrote a letter to the board of directors and quit. And then the next day I was offered by another organization, they offered to send me there. And they said, well, would you like to put your money where your mouth is and go and actually work on the other side, the unofficial side of the famine, work with the insurgent movements who have their own relief operation from a base in Sudan. So that was the moment. And I said, yeah. And within a week, I was in Khartoum. Yeah. Within 3 weeks after that, I'd made my first trip into the rebel areas, traveling at night to avoid the MiG fighter bombers.
I can't use the word assimilate into that culture, but to be thrust into that environment and have to earn the trust or earn the ability to work with people of the region who I imagine are both skeptical and also welcome you and welcome the help. What is it like to sort of just be implanted there?
I tell you, the feeling, it's very disorienting. It's very disturbing. By the time I got there, the famine had metastasized, and there were just tens of thousands of people pouring out into neighboring Sudan, in very advanced states of starvation. So absolutely, really, really grim. And there you are, and I'm not a doctor. I don't have any, you suddenly realize that you don't have, what is the skill that you're offering these people? You're helping to administrate a relief operation. But, when an elderly woman tugs you on the shoulder and wants you to come and look at her dying child, you go, but you have absolutely nothing to offer. So huge shock and humility of suddenly realizing how bad things can really be when situations are allowed or manifest themselves like that because of politics and injustice and other reasons, and you're in the middle of it trying to do something. Yeah. It's a very humbling experience. It's a very humbling experience.
Only imagine, and you were drawn in further. I mean, some people might run away. I maybe choose other different occupations after an experience like that. But you actually got your doctorate, and as part of that, returned to the area a few years later, correct?
Yeah, I did. It was probably about 10 years later, doing my my field work for my anthropology doctorate. So I actually lived in a village in the north of Ethiopia in a region called Tigray, which was the epicenter of the famine. And I lived there for 2 years. But, I got completely captivated by the people and what they were going through and the country and the challenges it was facing. And you do, when you stay there for that intensive period in a people's experience, you feel a bond. So it was actually delightful to go back, although living there for 2 years was not so delightful. It was pretty tough.
Did that experience bring closure to the work that you did in the height of the famine? Did that sort of capture some sort of capstone of what you did?
I mean, it did in the sense that the government had changed. The authoritarian government had actually been overthrown by the insurgent movements, and the insurgent movements were now in charge. And ostensibly, at least in the early years, they were doing really good things. So it felt very hopeful. And in fact, the famine on the scale that we saw in the mid-1980s hasn't actually happened again in that region. So the systems that were put in place, the safety nets for people, all of that was really, that did feel, I don't know about full circle, but it felt like something had changed in a positive direction.
And from that, you really, you have helped author or authored many works about the complexities of famine and the response to it. And I imagine that has helped guide some of the other work you've done as well in Iraq and other places. Are these complexities thematic around our response in crises?
I mean, some things yes and some things no. So they are. We do keep doing some of the same things, and we haven't quite moved on in some ways. So we do tend to think about emergency relief in one bucket and development aid and poverty reduction in another bucket. And those two worlds don't link to each other as much as they should do. You know, we're much better at doing relief than we are at prevention, even though it's a lot cheaper to do prevention. On the other hand, I think that famine was probably the last great famine where the government of the country was able to actually prevent a whole set of its population from getting aid, you know, under the idea that governments are sovereign and you can't interfere in a country's affairs. You know, since then, there's a principle that's been developed called responsibility to protect, which actually took off as well during the Rwandan genocide, that even when a government says, this is our business, stay out of it, you know, at a certain point, it becomes an issue of a crime against humanity not to intervene. So I feel like there has been movement in that direction.
So fast forward, I could stay on that topic forever, but we have a lot of ground to cover. You are in the ground on the ground, and then fast forward to your time working with the UK government and its response in Iraq, and I'm very struck by how that was a that kind of state rebuilding must be very different than the time of almost knowing your enemy, the enemy being famine, to trying to rebuild a state. Are there any differences in that kind of response that that you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, it's different in the sense that if you're in the midst of a full-blown famine, it's about getting food to people. It's about getting, you know, wet feeding to children under 5. It's about preventing outbreaks of infectious disease. And you know, the international community is kind of all over the place trying to do that. Usually it's a pretty good response system in the international community. In Iraq, it was much more about how do you know, after Saddam Hussein's machinery of government had been dismantled rather abruptly by the Americans, how do you stand up the capacity for governance in a country that is used to a very centralized authoritarian rule? So that's a very different undertaking. And in that case, what you shouldn't do really is go in and do it on behalf of the Iraqis. You shouldn't go in and run their ministries. You should try to work with them to enable them to run their, you know, stand up a Ministry of Finance, figure out how a parliament works. What are checks and balances mean? How do you decentralize? What should the relation between a provincial government and a central government be? So that's how, so that was when I was with the British government. That's how we worked. I will say, frankly, that when we looked across the green zone at what the Americans were doing, we felt they were actually trying to do it all themselves and not trying to build Iraqi capacity. And of course, at a certain point, the Americans were going to leave, and then the Iraqis were going to be on their own.
Right. And you've been in these challenging environments, immersed in them. And I wonder how people cope with that. Because you as a leader obviously have to be strong and make decisions that are for the best of hard decisions that are oftentimes for the best of the largest population. How did you cope with sort of being thrust into those operations?
I think during the famine, you don't have the luxury of not coping. Your not coping might mean that somebody suffers. So you just have to get over yourself and get on with it. I mean, in Iraq, it was different. We were in the green zone. So you're in a very sequestered environment. you travel out with close protection and armored vehicles and body armor. A very different kind of stress. I mean, that I had some members of, you have to watch your team very closely. For some, stress it manifests itself in different ways in circumstances like that. But I don't think I don't know. I never felt I could grant myself the luxury of having angst over whether, whether I was up to it or not. You just kind of, most people put in that situation, they do what they need to do. And most people do rise to the occasion. I don't think I'm anything special. I think it's just that I've had very special opportunities. Yeah.
And clearly very successful, because you were given the Officer of the Order of the British Empire for your work in Iraq. I have to ask, is it did that feel like a celebratory moment? Because you were given it still while things are in Iraq going on. So how does that?
Oh, actually, by that time I had left. I was in my first year as a British diplomat at the UN in New York. So I had left, but that was pretty wild, because you get taken to Buckingham Palace,
right?
And they have what's called an investiture ceremony, and there's a whole protocol and.
Right. It's fascinating. And going back to this idea of the differences, you have a very unique perspective, having worked in two of the global powerhouses, and been leading their international development operations in some capacity. And I just wonder, share a little bit about that difference between their approach and maybe the culture between the two?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because basically I worked in the aid department of government in both the UK government, which is where the bulk of my career was, and then I moved to do that in the US Agency for International Development under the Obama administration, and it was a real culture shock. Britain is still a relatively small country, and the people who go into the senior civil service of the British government do tend to be, Oxford or Cambridge educated, and they kind of all know each other. And they all sort of speak the same language. And so you can do a lot within government, and most of them are still running the government. That structure hasn't really broken down that much. You can really make decisions on the basis of gentlemen's agreements. Let's do it this way, chaps. Let's fetter our discretion a bit over here, and everybody knows what that means. When I got to the US, oh my God, everything has to be litigated. There's kind of administrative procedures for everything. It's a very different approach to government. It's much more about protecting the individual from the government in a way. And so you have so many procedures, and you can't just reach an informal agreement. It just doesn't work that way. Right. Plus, the US government is just so enormous that you spend quite a lot of your time just coordinating within the different departments of government, as opposed to looking outward.
Yeah. And I wonder also your experience in relief and aid, as you said, being do whatever we need to do to resolve this issue, versus your time working on the Millennium Development Goals, for instance, or working on other more policy agendas, which are constructed and vetted as opposed to responsive to emergent needs. How does that change how you have to operate and negotiate, as you said, with your colleagues?
It's really different. So I was one of the chief negotiators for the UK for what we call the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. So that's the global framework we have for the next 15 years to achieve a whole set of targets on sustainability and poverty reduction, et cetera. And that then it's much more incremental.
Right.
That framework was negotiated in the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is 93 member states. each of whom has an equal voice, and you have to reach agreement by consensus. And that's just, you really, I tell you, you know, my time as a diplomat, I take my hat off. It's grinding and it's tough, and you can spend an entire night in a chamber arguing over a sentence and the phrasing of a sentence. But in the end of the day, what you come out with is the framework that nations go forward with. But it's one step forward and 10 steps sideways.
Yeah. And it must be interesting to think when you're putting this together, whether or not it will, what is going to happen in that time that's going to either derail or accelerate or help and support, because we just living through the times we are, things are changing so fast.
Who could have predicted that this would happen? Although actually, if we'd been sensible, we would have seen that people were warning that pandemics are a big threat. And by the way, as the director of the United Nations Environment Program, I have to point out that one of the reasons they are is that we're destroying the natural world, which is actually the thing that regulates these diseases and keeps them in a wild environment and prevents them from jumping species to us.
So if we can fast forward to your time now as director, because it does seem as though this shift that you made from international development to and closely related to environmental work, but could you share a little bit about how it's been really focusing on environment versus humanitarian aid?
I mean, I kind of fell into it, I guess. So when the Trump administration was elected, all the Obama appointees all had to leave. So I was in Washington, D.C. I'd only been there a year after 30 years out of the country, and I was unemployed. So I needed a job. And I had a friend who was the executive director, the undersecretary general for the United Nations Environment Program, and said, come and work with us. And actually, it was very attractive because negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals was meant to be the bringing together of environmental and sustainability concerns with poverty reduction and economic growth and development and health and education. And we have that now. We have an integrated framework. But the communities of practice are very different. So when I moved to the environment, I felt, great, I'm working on an absolutely critical set of issues, and I negotiated the SDGs, and I know sustainable development, so I'll know all of this. Not at all. Very different community of practice, different intellectual ancestors, different language. So I've had to learn a lot of that, but it's been brilliant because to me, this is one of the, it's one of the challenges of the moment, and it's a critical agenda to be focusing on.
Is there you are the director of North America, but I can only imagine that you have great visibility around other areas of the world that are attending to somewhat of the same challenges, and there are very few issues that are going to affect all countries in the world, maybe to various degrees, but certainly all countries. Mm-hmm. Are there countries that are doing it well? Are there models that we should be learning from around international development and also the environmental practices they have?
Other countries that are doing it well. I mean, there are countries that are doing it well. There, if you think about Rwanda, for example, it's recovered from how many nations can bounce? Obviously they have the scars, but they've bounced back in an extraordinary way from the genocide in the mid-1990s. They've got some fantastic human development indicators, health and education. Their economic figures are really good. They leave us in the shade when it comes to the number of women in government, which, by the way, is part of their constitution. So yeah, there are countries that are doing it well. I mean, on the international stage, the international system is really built around American and Western leadership. And since the U.S. has taken a step back under the Trump administration, that's had you could say, well, that's allowed others to come in to lead, and it has to some extent, but because the US just has so many resources to bring to international governance that we miss having the US. But I would point out the Nordic countries, tiny countries. Okay, they're wealthy countries, particularly Norway with its sovereign wealth fund from oil exploration. Tiny countries, but they've put all their eggs in terms of international clout in the multilateral basket. You know, they invest heavily in the United Nations system. They feel that if, you know, investing in an organization that promotes the global good can only be good for them. And indeed, they punch way above their weight. God bless the Nordics.
Yeah. It seems to be that there are many countries who say or maybe project that they're doing things, and certainly in the U.S. there are many industries that try to promote their ESG, their environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And I'm wondering if you see that as a fad, as really impactful. Just any perspective on that you have.
Yeah, no, not, well, for the enlightened companies, of which there are many and growing, and enlightened investors, of which there are many and growing, it's not a fad at all. It's actually good business sense. And we've seen it move from, you know, what used to be called corporate social responsibility into ESG, but actually now it's much more about bringing sustainability into the heart of a company, into the heart of a business model, looking across the entire value chain. And saying, what does that mean for a company? How will that drive innovation? Yeah. How will that generate enterprise value? And companies like Unilever, who was one of the early leaders, you know, have done amazingly well and seen real benefits. They also realize that their customers, you know, care about this stuff. And, you know, they're not going to want to buy all that plastic stuff quite so much anymore. So.
Right. It's interesting to see the shift in countries like Vietnam, which have really come into a manufacturing role, and in some ways have to deal very much with the fragility of their country based on its location and the threat of climate change. I wonder, is this a trend that you're seeing other countries, emerging countries as well, shift towards because they see opportunity? And does the UN sort of view that as a real way to bring more people together and maybe share in the benefits of this?
I think when it comes to sort of environment and sustainability issues, more and more countries are really taking action. And it's not, you know, sometimes it's about enlightened leadership for global good, but most of the time it's actually what their citizens are pressing them for. So, you know, India, you know, a lot of Indian citizens are really fed up not being able to breathe the air, and their kids have asthma, and, you know, their sewers are clogged with single-use plastics, and the kids are getting, you know, so the pressure, and we've seen that in China as well, the pressure on governments to actually start taking this stuff seriously and doing something was really growing before the pandemic crisis. Now, what the pandemic is going to mean, whether countries just scramble back to the old way of doing things or take the opportunity to sort of leapfrog to a greener recovery, I think remains to be seen.
Do you think that the issues that you have prioritized, or that the UN has prioritized, not you individually, but are they going to shift because of the pandemic, do you think?
Is the UN going to shift?
Yeah.
I mean, the issues we deal with are largely determined by the member states. It's not, the UN itself is largely a reflection of the will of the member states. What's been really interesting is, you know, flying around the world for these big, you know, meetings, UN summits of tens of thousands of people, we've discovered actually maybe that way of business isn't what we should be doing. You know, there are many different ways to do global governance apart from getting on an airplane. So I think there's a lot of really interesting thinking going on in the UN Secretary General's office on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you have a meeting coming up in only a few months, right? That I guess is getting shifted due to this whole evolving crisis. Is that going to be do you know any? Is there any sense? Is that going to move totally online?
Do you mean the UN General Assembly?
The General Assembly, yeah.
Yeah. So this is evolving, but there is a feeling that world leaders, I think, are being discouraged from coming because they don't just come by themselves. Of course, they come with, an entourage. Mm-hmm. And the space in New York where these meetings are held is actually really small.
Right,
so
right.
It's very difficult. So it'll be some combination of live meetings, I think, relying heavily on the delegations from all the different member states that are actually in New York already. And probably a lot less travel.
Right.
I'm not sure, many people would be, dying to get on a plane to go to New York at the moment.
Right. Right. So you've had a career that I think has given you insight to some of the challenges in the world, clearly. And I wonder, and even in today's challenge that you're working with, I wonder how what motivates you? How, when you get up every morning and what gives you hope?
What gives me hope?
You're taking too long to answer that question.
No, I do have hope. I have hope. Well, so two things are going through my mind. One thing is young people who really care about this stuff and who are just fed up with what my generation and maybe a bit your generation have done. So they have fantastic ideas and they're incredibly switched on. But I was actually thinking of the demonstrations here in Washington. These are really diverse demonstrations of people who are coming together and saying, you know what, we care about humanity, we care about the integrity of an individual life, and there's something really uplifting about them. People do care about fundamental things, and at a certain point they feel pressed to show it.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're living through change. Obviously, we all know that, and in some moments in time, you look back and see the change. I wonder if you feel like you're actually seeing it in front of your eyes in different ways with regard to this prolonged period of a pandemic, or not in terms of a pandemic, it's long, but a prolonged period of quarantine and the demonstrations going on. How do you interpret the incredible will of the people to continue keeping these topics top of mind?
I think it's a hunger for leadership, for good leadership. If I'm allowed to say that, I'll probably be in trouble because I'm a UN official and I do, the United States is a very valued member state, but I think, at a certain point, people care about relying on science and what the science tells us. They care about human rights. Mm-hmm. They care about abuse of power. And so, we're seeing all that expressed. Is it a turning point? Is it a kind of pivot? Will I look back and say, well, that was a pivot moment? Yeah. I don't know yet. I don't know.
$64,000 question. Hopefully we can answer that the next time we talk. So I'd love to take just the last 5-7 minutes of our time together and talk a little bit about how you view careers in this field of work. We have a good number of people who are younger, and as you said, you have a lot of hope with them. So let's get them employed. What do you value in your colleagues and in the candidates you're looking at? What kind of experiences or skills do you think really make for a good diplomat or relief aid worker?
That's a tough question. I mean, if I were to offer some advice, if I can put it in those terms to young people starting out, first of all, I have every sympathy because this is the most bizarre market to look for a job in and try to break into a career. I think it must be very tough, but you know, get as much experience of the world as you possibly can. You know, that moment back in 1980, October 1984, when I got the phone call and they said, "Will you come?" I said yes. You know, I was very lucky I got that opportunity, but I think getting experience on the ground, there's no substitute for it. And do that early while you're young, because then you draw on that for the rest of your career. It's much harder to do that later on.
Yeah. Did you have any mentors when, as you were sort of moving around that you don't have to name them by name, but you know, that you, and do you think they were helpful?
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean, there were a couple of, it's interesting, they were all women, actually. A couple of very strong women who I met in the context of the war and famine in Ethiopia. And, we've remained lifelong friends.
Yeah.
And then a British woman who happened to be in, we did hostile environment training together before we went to Iraq.
How many
and
people
ended up in the same bunker, basically. She was training Iraqi police and I was doing the UK reconstruction program. Extraordinary woman of color who's now the deputy chief constable of the UK police force. So, you know, you meet people, once you get yourself out into situations like this, you meet the most extraordinary people.
It's fascinating. Do you anticipate going back to Africa soon? I mean, when things are, you know,
when you can get on an airplane again with confidence. I mean, I would love to. I went back to my village actually after 15 years, not that long ago in Ethiopia, and that was a really moving experience. I'd love to go back.
Yeah,
I'd love to go back. I don't know if I'd like to live there again. I feel like I've done that. I quite like my house and my garden now. I think I'll stay here, but I'd like to visit.
There are some questions that we commonly ask, and have there been any Psi Us that you've run across in your career? 30 years outside of the country may reduce that number, but I just want to, always very interested.
So recently we had a reunion of some Psi U women, the female brothers, as you call us, which was brilliant. And there were women that I literally had not seen in 40 years.
Wow.
So that was amazing. I also met a fellow Psi Upsilon who was a couple of years ahead of me, an Eritrean gentleman who was actually one of the guerrilla fighters, a member of the Politburo of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front when I was in the Horn of Africa. And we gave each other the secret handshake in the middle of the war zone. And then he subsequently became the first ambassador to the United States of Eritrea upon its independence in 1994. So that was pretty cool. So Psi Us pop up all over the place.
Well, Dr. Hendrie, thank you so much. I think we are at 45 minutes and I want to be mindful of everybody's Zoom capacity to be on Zoom all day. Jonathan, are there any questions that you want to point out that we didn't hit, or maybe close us out?
Sure. One, I think in particular, from John Simmons, he writes, of the many government and NGO organizations doing service work in Africa, Peace Corps, UNHM, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, American Friends, Mercy Corps, etc. Which do you think have been the most effective in helping improve lives?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. I mean, it depends what you're talking about because they each do different things. I mean, ACFEM is fantastic. Both relief and development work. They're very, very good on water programs for water supply. You know, the International Refugee Committee is brilliant on refugee issues and all things displaced. In fact, the head of that is the former UK Foreign Secretary, David Miliband. You know, Médecins Sans Frontières does brilliant work in war zones. So each has their strength. I wouldn't like to single any one of them out.
Okay, from Andy Stamp, a question about SDGs in relation to water. There are two goals that directly address water, but also many other goals for which clean water and/or water security are a prerequisite. How is UNEP integrating water considerations into work on other SDGs?
Yeah, so absolutely crucial. So UNEP has responsibility for those bits of the SDG target framework that are specifically environment related. So for example, we do a lot of work on freshwater habitat and marine environments. If you think about water supply, that's probably more the UN development program. But it's interesting that that got raised because it was a key thread running through the negotiations. It was one of those group of issues that kept coming up as cross-cutting for so many different, achieving so many different parts of the goal framework.
That's fascinating.
I guess one final question before we move on to some housekeeping. China is said to be a major investor in African nations. Are there any concerns of the UN and others about China's influence on environmental change there that you care to speak to?
So China is a huge investor in Africa, actually. It's built a lot of roads, particularly in the Horn of Africa. And it has a very ambitious initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to kind of link a lot of countries together, almost along the old Silk Trail. Mm-hmm. China is very pragmatic, and that can sometimes lead to concerns being raised about really, are they meeting the sort of global environmental and social standards for big infrastructure programs? But every country, as you learn when you're a diplomat, cares about its reputation. China cares about what people think about it. And so, a lot of UN agencies are working closely with China to make sure that that can happen. And also to give power to the elbow of countries who are the recipient of that investment, to be able to say, well, actually, we want this rather than this, and to make sure that it's an equitable conversation.
Great. All right, then I'm going to just bring up our next couple of speaker series, and then I'll hand it back to Alex to close us out. So some ways that all of our attendees can continue to participate with the speaker series and with the foundation. To register for upcoming speaker series. We routinely update sciu.org with news and news articles, things that our members are doing. We have a professional network on LinkedIn where people can network to help either improve their careers, or if they're just starting out in their career, to make professional contacts. Our current upcoming speaker lineup, I've only listed 3 here, but we actually have many. We're working on the slate up through the fall. Next week, we are starting our summer hospitality series, talking about wine and vineyards with Cushing Donovan. He is a Gamma from 05, and he is the director of marketing for Donovan Family Wines. I believe he actually has a special rate on some wine packages for brothers if they're interested in trying to have something shipped to drink along with. And then in July, we're going to continue the hospitality series, talking about beer and brewing with Tom Schmidlin, who's ADA 88. After completing his graduate work, he changed gears and started postdoc brewing in Washington State. And then we're going to move more in a career direction. Jessie Newman is a Georgia Tech graduate. And she's 6 years into her career. She went through the internship program at Google and then worked there for 5 years, and then became an algorithmic engineer, software engineer for a trading company in New York. And she will be discussing navigating an early software engineering career. Thank you all. We've received several donations through the course of the series tonight. Thank you very much. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Alex.
No, I just want to say, I think the time with you Dr. Hendrie was fantastic, and I think the career you've had is something that we want to applaud more, and I look forward to hopefully being able to address some of the unanswered questions or not fully answered questions in person in the future. But till then, my sincere appreciation for doing this, and thank you to all the participants for being with us on what is now, it's now light out. So I can only imagine that you're looking forward to enjoying the rest of your night. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So much.